Well, environmental activists lost an appeal to the environmental minister over her decision to allow Eskom to bypass pollution controls at some of its plants. As Eskom battles to keep the lights on with unpredictable stages of power cuts, its fleet is being pushed to the limits and breaching emission regulations. Climate Justice Coalition General Secretary Dr. Alex Lenferna joins us now to explain their concerns and what they plan to do next. Good evening to you and welcome to the program. It's really great to have you on with us. Eskom, we are told, essentially has its back against the wall. It's having to run these plants harder while figuring out how to do its maintenance and upgrades. And this emissions allowance is likely to be a temporary measure. What do you think of their reasoning?
Yeah, thank you for having us, and good evening to you and to your viewers. I think that this situation is a completely avoidable situation. We, the civil society, have been warning about this for the longest time, that we face a shortfall in energy supply, and so we desperately needed to invest in new generation, with renewables being the quickest way to bring on new energy generation. And so now Eskom and the government has put themselves in this situation where they're stuck with this old polluting fleet that is in dire need of maintenance. And instead of properly maintaining it, now they're running it extra hard, which also raises very worrying concerns about, if we're running the plant so hard right now rather than properly maintaining them, does that mean further down the line, are we going to see these plants going into even worse performance than they've had before? And so our campaign for a Green New Eskom for a long time has been pushing for the urgent need to invest in alternative energy so that we don't have to rely as heavily on these plants, which, by reaching these emissions limits, which are already very, very weak emissions limits, we are killing thousands of people every year through air pollution.
Well, that's the point I wanted us to come to next. But just to comment on what you had said in your opening answer, it sounds like this is a structural issue, one that should have been paid attention to a long time ago. And so any kind of intervention is not going to yield immediate results in terms of what alternatives could be provided. So the warning that you're sounding out there certainly is incredibly concerning. Let's talk about the environmental and people risks that you've also outlined, that you were hoping the minister, especially the environmental minister here, would take heed to or pay special attention to.
Yeah, I mean, the environmental and health impacts are massively significant. Often they get dismissed as if they're fringe concerns, but this is a matter of life and death for many of people. It's a matter of health and well-being. And so, thousands of people in Mpumalanga, according to studies, are dying every year as a result of these breaches in emission reduction regulations, right? South Africa has some of the weakest regulations in the world, and yet we're breaching those by far. In some places, I think it's up to 30 times over the limits, which is just crazy. And that's bad for the people of Mpumalanga, but it's also bad for the people here in Gauteng, which is where I'm based. My 11-year-old has asthma and has missed days and days of school just because of the severe problematic air pollution that we have here in Johannesburg, where we've seen some of the worst air quality in the world. And that's a large part because of the air pollution that comes from coal. And that is damaging the lungs of our children. It is impairing their development, and it is causing devastating health impacts. And so this trade-off that Eskom is making, which it could have not have had to made, is really being counted in lost life and lost well-being, and in devastating impacts across the economy, and tens of billions of rands worth of health impacts as a result of that pollution. So it really is a devastating toll that they inflict on the
When you talk about the environmental concerns, specifically the health impacts, it all goes down to this Flugas desulfurization, which is one of the areas where Eskom is kind of going, around the regulation for one reason or another, but it's having these impacts that you're talking about. It forms a big part of how Eskom should be operating. Just enlighten our viewers about that.
Yeah. So that's one of the technologies that Eskom can use to make coal slightly less polluting. So Flugas desulfurization, it's basically like a scrubber that they're supposed to install on the flue ducts of the coal power plants, right? And that helps draw out sulfur pollution, which is one of the worst forms of pollution that comes from the coal power plants and has pretty devastating impacts on communities. And at Kusile, for example, they have tried to circumvent the need for those particular technologies. And they've done the same at Medupi coal power plant, even though they promised as part of the construction that they would install them. And so I think what we see from Eskom is a long history of failed promises to actually deliver on technologies that could make coal slightly cleaner, slightly less polluting. But the bottom line is that even with those technologies, coal is still very polluting and still very harmful, because it only removes some of the pollutants, and it also doesn't reduce things like greenhouse gas emissions, which contribute to the devastating climate crisis, the effects of which are being felt across the country and arguably had a role to play in making the Western Cape floods more likely. And so, I think there's no such thing as clean coal. I mean, clean coal is a dirty lie, but even the small technologies we could be using to make it a little bit less polluting aren't being put in place.
Wow, so there's so much to deal with there. Government says it has a health mitigation plan that's on the table. Have you seen it, and what do you make of it?
Yeah, so one of the coalition members is the Center for Environmental Rights, and they've been looking at the health mitigation plan and commenting on how inadequate it is. I mean, the thing is that a lot of these coal-impacted communities that are living under the shadow of the pollution of these coal power plants, they have woefully inadequate health facilities. And so the idea that, you might get an additional screening here and there, or there might be a little bit of additional healthcare facilities, I think is laughable for a lot of those communities, because they're barely getting any healthcare as things stand. And so they're expected to just take this additional pollution with the hope that maybe the government will deliver a little bit better healthcare for them. Yeah. Which, it's not really delivering in reality.
Alex, given that the situation's not going to change in the interim, and it's been characterized as a choice between keeping the lights on and worrying about people's health, we are going to, it's a situation that's going to persist. You had threatened court action. Are you going to follow through?
Yeah, so some of the coalition members are taking the government to court on these minimum emission standards, because, as I said before, this was an avoidable situation, and in order for us to address it, we need to be urgently taking action now to invest in cleaner alternative energies and to allow us to have the space so that we're not stuck in what is basically a Sophie's choice between electricity supply or people's health and lives, right? Yeah. And so we need the government to take urgent action, and I think the court case is one way of forcing them to do this. But we're also trying to build pressure and driving campaigns like our Green New Eskom campaign, which is about trying to ensure that the policies and the investment is in place so that Eskom is driving a transition to renewables, which can, better provide energy and do so in a way that doesn't sacrifice the lives of South Africans.
Well, we have to keep talking about this, and we have to have Eskom around the table. We have invited Eskom to follow up on this discussion, so it's not the last you'll be hearing on the score. Dr. Alex Lenferna, who is with the Climate Justice Coalition. Thank you for your time.